First of all, there's zero question that we live in a surveillance state, no matter how one understands that term. The National Security Agency collects 1.7 billion emails and telephone calls and stores them every single day.
What's wrong with mass surveillance? Surely it's just for our own good? Maybe. But let me tell you about Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was one of the oddest philosophers to have ever lived, and that's saying something. He was a remarkable and variously talented man. His interests spanned far further than the farthest reaches of philosophy. On the occasion of his death, he demanded that he be autopsied and his soft parts put on display at his own funeral, in front of his mourners. His skeleton, at his own request, was extracted, seated, and clothed in his black suit. He's still on display today. Of course, the preservation process wasn't perfect. That's his body, but it's a wax head. His real head's between his legs. It didn't preserve great. But the point is that Bentham also had an interest in designing prisons, and he designed a very particular one, called the panopticon. The design was a work of genius for one key reason. There is a central guard tower from which a prison officer can see into each and every cell. The prisoners would never know whether they were being watched or not, and with the ever-present possibility of observation, the whole prison community could be kept within peaceful behavioural boundaries. One officer could control an entire prison. Perhaps I labour the point, or perhaps not, as I'm yet to actually reveal what my point is. My point is this. If you tell a population they may be being observed, they will behave like they are being observed. And therefore there is no practical difference between a population being observed and thinking they might be observed. In psychology, it has long been established that if a group of people know that they are being observed, they will change their behaviour to meet the observer's expectations. This is broadly called reactivity, and the most famous case of this is the Hawthorne effect. Near the beginning of the 20th century in the state of Illinois, the Hawthorne Works, a large factory complex, commissioned a series of studies intended to understand under what conditions workers were most productive. They lowered the lights and they raised the lights. When they lowered the lights, they found that the workers were more industrious. When they raised the lights, they found the workers were more industrious. Only when they stopped observing, in both cases, did the productivity decrease. The conclusion drawn from this is that it's nothing to do with the light that makes people work harder. It's the fact of being observed. So we know that being observed makes us behave in the way our observers want us to. But my contention is that believing that we might be being observed is functionally the same as actually being observed. In the oversighted opening of George Orwell's 1984, we are introduced to the hero, Winston Smith, and also to the box that watches him. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 9th three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was of course no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. In Book 2 of Plato's Republic, Socrates and Glaucon consider a famous story of their time, the story of Gyges of Lydia, Glaucon's telling of the story has Gyges' ancestor discover a magical ring. This ring has the ability to make the wearer invisible. As the story goes, he uses the power to kill the king and marry the queen. But Glaucon's point is that any man, moral or not, given the chance to behave unobserved, and thus with no consequences, would steal, rape, and kill. But I disagree. Along the lines of Socrates, behaving justly is an integral ingredient to the happy life. And enforced observation, I would argue, is counter to the good life. It's no coincidence that in the following paragraphs of Orwell's 1984, Winston finds an alcove that is unobserved by the telescreen. When Gyges is invisible, he goes and murders the king, but when Winston is unobserved, he writes a diary. As the NSA grows, as governments around the world become more and more interested in our internet activity, as our locations, interests, inclinations, communications, lives become increasingly online, the threat of being observed in the hunt for terrorists escalates in importance. This puts us all in the position of the prisoner in Bentham's panopticon, knowing that we might be observed and thus acting like we are. Some of us may be like Gyges, we may want to perform terrible acts unobserved, yet most of us, I suspect, are like Winston Smith. We simply want our privacy, to do what we want without Big Brother watching us. The problem is that any kind of panopticon surveillance treats us all the same.
The NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends. So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so.
You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Well, that was a depressing video if ever there was one. Do let me know what you think in the comments below. I was just trying out something a bit different, maybe a full-on argument there, drawing on various things. I hope you enjoyed it. As ever, subscribe, and I will see you again next time.